Alex was always on time. His life ticked forward like a metronome. Each morning unfolded in perfect rhythm. The espresso machine hissed to life at 7:15. The calendar pinged its reminders, and the city outside rose like a well-rehearsed orchestra. On paper, he had everything. A good job, a sleek apartment, inbox zero, a tailored routine. But each night, long after the lights dimmed and the emails faded into the ether, Alex would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by a question he couldn't articulate. It hovered there like the hum of the refrigerator, persistent, just beyond language. What is all this for? He had no answer. It was during one of those gray October Sundays, when the world felt paused and colorless, that Alex took his usual jog through the park. Trees half naked with fall shed their leaves in slow spirals. Joggers passed with earbuds in, mothers pushed strollers, a man played saxophone. Beneath a bridge arch, it was all familiar, predictable, except for the old man. He was sitting alone on a worn bench under an oak tree, hands resting lightly in his lap, eyes open but unmoving. No phone, no book, no podcast, just stillness. It wasn't the kind of stillness that screamed boredom or fatigue. It was deeper, like the earth itself had learned to breathe through him. Alex would have kept running. But as he passed, the man looked up, not with curiosity or recognition, but with a kind of quiet knowing. It stopped Alex mid-stride. "Where are you going?" the man asked, his voice like wind passing through old wood, warm, grounded, unhurried. Alex glanced at his smartwatch. "Nowhere really, just my usual loop around the park. And after that, home, shower, prep for Monday, and after all of that, where are you really going?" That question didn't land like a challenge. It landed like a stone in still water. Alex opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Not because he didn't have words, but because the words he usually gave, to succeed, to be better, to build a future, sounded like slogans suddenly stripped of meaning. "I don't know," he finally said. The old man's eyes softened, not with sympathy, but with recognition. "Most don't, but the question is still worth asking." He stood slowly, brushing off the sleeves of a faded wool coat, and walked a few steps forward. Then, without turning fully, he said, "If you ever decide to remember who you are beneath all the noise, come back here. But next time, don't wear your watch." And then he disappeared into the trees. Alex stood still for a long time. The rustle of leaves seemed louder now. The wind, colder. Something had shifted, not outside, but within. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden clarity. It was more like a door creaked open somewhere deep inside. A door he didn't even know existed. That night, he didn't set his Monday alarm. He didn't meditate. He didn't play ambient music or light a candle. He just sat on the edge of his bed, surrounded by the faint whirring of appliances and the soft ticking of the wall clock. For the first time, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of things he had forgotten. Memories returned, not as visions, but as sensations. The teacher who praised him for being so well behaved. The father who told him, "Don't dream too big." The mother who always said, "Smile, no matter what." These voices weren't loud. They were quiet, layered, embedded like wallpaper under coats of adult identity. And yet, they shaped him. crafted the version of himself that woke up every day to chase goals he never questioned. He stared at his calendar. It was color-coded and packed. Meetings, deadlines, workouts, calls. The image of that bench in the park floated into his mind. The stillness of the old man. The question, where are you really going? For the first time, his calendar felt like a cage. He closed the laptop. He walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Everything inside was labeled, prepped, stacked. Kale, almond milk, protein shakes. There was order. There was control. And yet, he had never felt more distant from himself. He stood there for a long time, the cold air washing over his face, and realized he couldn't even remember the last time he tasted something. Not just consumed it, but truly tasted it. Almost without thinking, he began to pack a small bag. Not everything, just enough. Some clothes, a notebook, a pen, and one photo. A boy, maybe 6, holding a dandelion, cheeks puffed, eyes wide with wonder. Himself. He paused to look at the photo. It was wrinkled at the corners, a little, faded, but still vibrant where it mattered. That child hadn't known about meetings or networking or promotions. He only knew the joy of watching a dandelion scatter like stars. No plan, no destination, just a quiet inner pull, like something inside him was finally asking to be listened to. He didn't know what he was looking for, but something in him already knew. It wouldn't be found in a spreadsheet or a status update. It wasn't out there. It was back here, where he'd forgotten to look. The school with no walls. The city still buzzed that Monday morning, but Alex was no longer part of it. While meetings clicked into place like gears in a machine and subway cars groaned their way through tunnels, he sat on a half-empty train moving out of the city. He hadn't told anyone, not his manager, not his parents, not even the friend who usually tracked his runs through a fitness app for the first time in years. He had no plan, no spreadsheet, no reason to explain. All he knew was that something in him had shifted, and whatever had opened inside, it wanted space. He got off in a small town 2 hours north, a place with more pine trees than traffic lights. No towers, no coffee chains, no networking opportunities. Just air that smelled of moss and wood smoke, and a dirt trail that curled away from the station like a forgotten sentence. He started walking. With every step, the buzz of the city faded, replaced by birdsong and the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes. His phone lost signal halfway up the first hill, and when it did, something curious happened. He smiled. After hours of walking, he reached a clearing. A low wooden building stood at the center, not more than a single floor high. No gate, no signage, no grand entryway. It looked like it had been built not to stand out, but to disappear into the trees. There was no welcome banner, no one waiting outside. Still, Alex stepped in. Inside, it was even simpler. No desks, no chalkboards. Just a wide room with wooden floors, open windows, and a few people going about their tasks. One woman, robed in gray, was washing a bowl with deliberate care. Another swept a corner in silence. A third sat still by the window, her eyes not closed but vast, as if she were listening to something ancient. No one asked his name. No one offered tea or a clipboard. The woman passed by him, handed him a small folded note, and continued on. Alex opened it. In fine, handwritten ink, it read, "Watch everything, say nothing." So he stayed. At first, he waited for a lecture, a philosophy, a teacher with some grand truth. But nothing came. Only a gesture from an older man toward a dirty window. Alex was handed a cloth, so he cleaned. At first, his thoughts ran wild. What is this place? Are they testing me? Am I wasting my time? But gradually, something began to slow down, not outside, but inside. His breath became deeper. His shoulders dropped. He stopped thinking about what came next. The more he wiped the glass, the clearer it became. And strangely, so did he. He didn't know how long he stood there, but it felt like he had stepped out of time. He noticed things he hadn't in years. The squeak of the cloth, the warmth of the sun on his back, the gentle dance of dust in the light. No one had instructed him to pay attention. Attention simply arrived when everything else fell away. The next day, he was asked to carry buckets of water from the nearby well. The day after that, to sweep leaves from the path. There was no rotation chart, no one checking his progress, no rewards. Just one task at a time, offered without explanation. And slowly, the part of him that always needed to do it right began to dissolve. Here, there were no grades, no performance reviews, no gold, stars, just presence. And presence was the real teacher. By the 5th day, something inside him had softened. He found himself humming quietly while stacking firewood. He didn't need to impress anyone. He wasn't watching himself anymore. He simply moved, like water over stones. That afternoon, while scrubbing steps, an elderly man sat beside him, barefoot, wrinkled hands, eyes that looked like they had seen the inside of storms. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "When a student is ready, there is no teacher, only attention." Alex turned toward him, confused. "In school," the man continued, "they gave you answers and called it knowledge, but no one taught you how to see." "See what?" Alex asked. The man smiled. "Everything, especially yourself." Then he stood and walked away, leaving only the scent of cedar and a silence that felt like home. That night, Alex didn't dream in images. He dreamed in sensations. The softness of the floor beneath him, the cool water on his palms, the echo of a crow's call in the early light. It was as if the world had begun whispering through ordinary things, and for the first time, he could hear it. He remembered being a boy again, building imaginary cities out of couch cushions, totally absorbed, never thinking about whether what he was doing had value. He wasn't performing. He was simply being. But somewhere along the way, that way of being had been replaced by roles: student, achiever, team player, leader. And with each role came scripts. With each script, a little less space to breathe. Now, with no one telling him who to be, he was remembering how to listen, how to be with a task fully, how to feel the texture of wood under his fingers, how to kneel without needing to rise. He realized something profound in its simplicity. He wasn't here to gather information. He was here to unlearn. The Room of Quiet Voices. Alex woke just before dawn. Not from a sound, not from a dream. Just a quiet pull, like something deep inside had gently tapped his shoulder. The wooden hall around him was still wrapped in sleep. Other guests were curled beneath thin blankets, breathing slow and deep. There was no urgency, but he rose anyway. Barefoot, he stepped out into the morning mist, not to get anywhere, but simply because his body felt called to move. The ground was cool underfoot, soft with dew. The forest whispered with the smallest sounds, leaves rustling without wind, a bird calling in the distance, the subtle creak of branches waking with the light. He didn't plan where to go. He let the path choose him. Wandering between mossy stones and stacked firewood, he found it. A low, round structure tucked behind the trees. It looked almost like a hobbit house, made of cedar, half sunken into the earth, with a door barely visible in the shadows. The wood was old, weathered, and half open, as if it had been expecting him. He stepped inside. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of something old, dust, cedar, perhaps incense from long ago. Light filtered in through slits in the walls, catching particles in midair like glittering thoughts suspended in silence. Cushions formed a circle on the wooden floor. There were no candles, no altar, no scripture, just presence. Saturday. There was no voice, no instruction, no meditation bell, just his breath and the echo of it against the silence. At first, nothing happened, but slowly something did. Not a vision, not a thought, more like a stirring, a current beneath the surface, a whisper, not in his ears, but inside his chest. Don't say that. They'll laugh at you. It was quiet, familiar, and it landed not like a threat, but like a memory. Before he could question it, another surfaced. You're only valuable when you're useful. Then another. If you fail, they'll leave. Alex opened his eyes, startled, but the room hadn't changed. Still quiet, still empty, still filled with something unnamed. The voices kept coming, uninvited but unstoppable. They weren't yelling. They didn't accuse. They simply appeared, like old recordings left running in the background of his life. Don't cry. Be strong. You're too much. You're not enough. He didn't try to answer. He didn't try to make them stop. He just listened. And what he heard wasn't cruelty. It was fear. The kind of fear that learns to protect. The kind that wraps itself around a child and says, "Don't show them who you are. It's not safe." The voices weren't enemies. They were parts of him, fragments left behind in moments he thought he had outgrown. But here, in the silence, they rose like mist from the forest floor. He remembered the teacher who called him disruptive for asking too many questions. The uncle who told him real men don't cry. The classmate who laughed when he shared his writing. None of it had felt like trauma at the time, but now he saw it. These were the moments that taught him to build walls. Invisible ones. The kind that let you function, succeed, even be admired, while silently forgetting who you really are. And then came a memory, not of pain, but of peace. He saw a boy, himself, sitting cross-legged under a table while adults argued above. Sunlight filtered through a tablecloth, casting ripples of light like underwater waves. The boy wasn't scared. He wasn't confused. He was drawing, creating his own world with crayons on the hardwood floor. And he was smiling, fully absorbed, fully safe. He had forgotten that feeling. But now it returned, not just as a memory, but as an embodied truth. That boy hadn't gone anywhere. He had simply been hidden. Alex felt tears gathering. Not dramatic, not overwhelmed, just present. Not grief, not even sadness, just a kind of gratitude, like welcoming home a long-lost part of himself. He stayed in the room for a long time. Time didn't seem to move. He watched the light shift across the floor, watched his breath move his chest, watched the voices. Inside him slow down, not because he silenced them, but because they had finally been heard. When he stood, his legs were stiff, but his heart was open. Before stepping out, he looked once more toward the center of the room, not to bow, not to thank, but to acknowledge. He whispered, "I see you." He wasn't sure who he was speaking to. Maybe the voices, maybe the boy, maybe the part of himself that had finally stayed still long enough to listen. The air outside felt different, softer. The trees no longer looked like scenery. They looked like witnesses. And the silence he carried was no longer heavy. It was alive. The mirror in the forest. The forest had begun to feel like a second skin. Alex walked through it not as a visitor anymore, but as someone returning home to a place he didn't know he'd left. There was no destination, no map. His legs moved because they wanted to, not because they had to. The trees whispered with each breeze. The light played between branches like flickers of old dreams, and the ground carried his steps as gently as a mother carrying a sleeping child. He wandered further than he ever had before, past the places he knew, beyond the well, beyond the bell that marked the retreat's daily rhythm. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became, not just around him, but within. There was no mental to-do list running in the background, no calculations, No inner narrator pointing out how he was changing. There was only presence, and the sound of his breath, and the soft, living silence of the forest. And then, just as he was about to turn back, he saw it. A pool. It was small, no larger than a bedroom, but perfectly still, perfectly round, nestled in a hollow embraced by moss-covered stones. The trees leaned over it like guardians. Their leaves made a canopy that dappled the light across the surface. The water shimmered without moving. It was not just beautiful. It was sacred, not in the religious sense, but in the way a child instinctively knows to whisper when entering a room. That holds something holy. He stepped closer, knees bending as he crouched beside the edge. The surface reflected the world with such precision that it almost didn't look like water. It looked like a window. And in that window, he saw himself. Not the version he adjusted in Zoom meetings. Not the face he practiced for interviews, or the polite smile he offered strangers. This face was raw, bare, unsure, and deeply familiar. He expected a voice in his head to begin its usual commentary, to critique, analyze, evaluate. But nothing came. There was no judgment, only a kind of still attention. And in that attention, the reflection began to change, not morph, not distort, but reveal. He saw the boy again, the one from the room of quiet voices. But this time, not in memory. He was there, in the water, in the trees, in the wind brushing his cheeks. A boy who once built kingdoms from sticks, who climbed trees not to reach anything but to feel what it was like to be high. A boy who once asked if clouds had names and whether dreams could be mailed to God. A boy who had not yet learned to be ashamed of wonder. Alex felt something catch in his throat. Where had that boy gone? He hadn't disappeared. He had been covered, layer by layer, roll by roll. Encouragements that became expectations. Compliments that became cages. You're so mature. You're so composed. You're going places. None of it had been ill-intentioned, but it had taught him to trade presence for performance, aliveness for achievement. He cupped his hands into the water and brought it to his face. It was cold, shocking, and real. It made his breath hitch. It made him feel awake in a way he hadn't in years. When he looked again into the pool, the reflection remained still, but now he saw more than his face. He saw the years, not as a montage of moments, but as a weight, subtle, silent, accumulated. The time he'd said yes when he meant no. The time he'd stayed quiet to avoid conflict. The way he smiled when he didn't feel safe. The way he gave people what they wanted so they wouldn't leave. Each gesture had seemed small, but together, they had built a version of him that was efficient, likable, impressive, and exhausted. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the notebook he had brought, but never dared open. He sat cross-legged on the mossy edge and let the pen touch the page, not to write goals, or journal his insights, or summarize the experience, just to see what came out. The words arrived slowly. A phrase, a sentence, then a pause, then another. Not linear, not polished, like a child learning to speak again, not to communicate, but to express. A memory surfaced. He wrote it down. A fear arrived. He named it. A thought he never admitted, even to himself, took shape, and he let it. There was no rush, no audience, no need to make it meaningful. The notebook became a mirror as much as the pool. And for the first time, he wasn't writing to be understood. He was writing to remember. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the forest floor. The light caught the surface of the pool one last time, and the leaves above shimmered like stained glass. Alex closed the notebook, held it to his chest, and exhaled. He whispered, "I see you." He wasn't sure who. He meant himself, maybe. The boy, the forest, the stillness, maybe all of them. On his way back, everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had stopped looking at it through the lens of utility. The trees weren't beautiful because they were symmetrical. They were beautiful because they simply were. Just like him. He didn't need to earn his place in this forest. He already belonged. And for the first time, the silence he carried didn't ask for a response. It asked for presence. The breath that opened the sky. Alex awoke before the sun, not because he meant to, not because of any plan, but because something inside had already risen with the light. The room was still cloaked in a soft blue hush, and the walls seemed to breathe with him. He didn't stretch. He didn't reach for his phone. He just sat up slowly, as if waking not just from sleep, but from forgetting. Outside, the forest wore a blanket of mist. It curled between the trees like memory, quiet, persistent, and strangely warm. The dew kissed his bare feet as he stepped into the clearing behind the retreat house, drawn by something he couldn't name. There was no path to follow, no reason to go, only a quiet inner pull. And there, in the center of a ring of stones, sat the old man. He was the same one from the park, or at least he felt the same. He sat cross-legged, unmoving, the kind of stillness that doesn't demand attention but awakens it. He didn't gesture. He didn't speak. And yet, Alex knew to sit. So he did. The moss beneath him was cool and damp, grounding him like a truth too old for words. For a while, they said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have been too loud. Then the old man spoke, gently. "Breathe," Alex inhaled. "No," the old man said, softer this time. "Not that way. Don't take the breath. Let it find you." Alex frowned slightly, but tried again. This time, he didn't inhale with effort. He allowed it. And in that moment, something shifted, not in his lungs, but in his awareness. Air didn't rush in like a task being done. It arrived like a gift being received. His chest rose without will. His ribs expanded without command. The breath was not his to control. It was breathing him, like the tide, like sleep, like love before we learn to earn it. And with that breath came a loosening, a subtle undoing in his body. The jaw he always clenched without noticing, the shoulders that carried invisible weight, the thoughts that usually scattered like startled birds, all of them softened. He didn't think. This is meditation. He didn't think anything. He simply sat and was breathed, and time dissolved. He didn't know if minutes passed, or hours, or seasons. There was no ticking clock, no desire to measure, just breath, just awareness, just the feeling of something ancient moving through him, reminding him of a rhythm older than memory. Then something arrived, not a vision, not quite, more like a remembering. He was 6, curled beneath a table while grown-ups argued in sharp, exhausted voices above. He wasn't scared. He was watching the sunlight flicker through the tablecloth, painting waves of golden light across the floor. In the middle of chaos, he felt stillness. Not the kind you seek, but the kind that seeks you. He hadn't thought of that moment in decades. But now it returned whole. And with it came tears, not of grief, not of drama, but of recognition. Like a bell that had always been ringing, and he had finally heard it again. And in the breath that followed, more memories came, not as burdens, but as truths. The first time he lied to be accepted. The first time he laughed along so he wouldn't be laughed at. The first time he won something and felt nothing. Each moment floated up like a leaf on water. He didn't resist them. He didn't fix them. He just watched. There was no judgment, just clarity. And then the sky changed. Not metaphorically, literally. Clouds that had thickened overhead began to part, slowly, silently, as if something in the world had exhaled too. Light spilled through the gap like a secret too long held. It wasn't dramatic, but it was holy. The old man smiled without moving. Alex didn't look at the light. He looked through it, or maybe within it. And something looked back. It wasn't God exactly. It wasn't some heavenly figure descending in radiant beams. It was closer, quieter, deeper. It was the knowing behind all knowing, the awareness that watched him watching. The life behind the breath. And it was not separate. It didn't speak. It didn't explain. It simply was. And for the first time, Alex felt what every book, every sermon, every podcast had tried to describe but never could. This wasn't something to be reached. It was something to return to. The breath didn't open the sky. The breath removed what kept it hidden. He sat in that stillness until even the desire to hold on to it dissolved. He no longer needed proof, no longer needed words. The experience was not his to keep, it was his to be. When the old man finally rose, he didn't offer a lesson. He didn't summarize the moment. He simply placed a hand on Alex's shoulder and whispered, "This is not something you'll keep, it's something you'll return to." Alex nodded. Not in understanding, but in agreement. The sky overhead was vast now, not because it had changed, but because he had stopped looking at it through a ceiling. And within his breath, he felt the pulse of everything. The day they took his name. It began as a whisper, not in the air, but in his thoughts, a faint stirring beneath the surface of silence. After the breath, after the stillness, after the sunlight split the clouds, there was a question, not loud, not urgent, but persistent. Who gave me this name? Alex had never questioned it. His name had always been there, like gravity, like background noise, like wallpaper in a childhood room. It was the first thing people asked, the first thing he offered. It sat on business cards, echoed in meetings, marked the top of every form. But now, something about it felt heavy. Not wrong, just filled. He walked the narrow path behind the retreat house, his feet brushing the gravel like they were tracing a memory. The sky was low with clouds, and the trees swayed without wind. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, listening. At the edge of the garden stood a small wooden building. He'd passed before but never entered. It looked like a library, though no sign announced it. Just wood, time-worn and quiet. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and stories long forgotten. Books lined the walls, not alphabetically, not by genre, but by presence. They looked untouched, yet alive, as if waiting to be read not with the eyes, but with the heart. A journal lay open on a table in the center of the room. The pages were yellowed, the ink soft and fading. He sat before it, and the words on the page seemed to rise toward him. I was born as light, then they gave me a name. His chest tightened. He couldn't remember the first time someone called him Alex, but he could remember the first time it mattered. The first time it was used not to call him, but to define him. Smart, polite, promising, reliable. Each word, once sweet, now rang like a bell with no echo. He began to trace moments, not grand traumas, just subtle shaping. The teacher who praised him for sitting still, not speaking up. The coach who liked him because he followed instructions without complaint. The counselor who told him his dreams were nice, but maybe unrealistic. The relative who said, "Don't be so sensitive. You're a boy." None of them meant harm. But harm isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, repetitive, wrapped in approval. He flipped the journal. More words. They told me what to be before I knew who I was. I smiled so they would keep loving me. I shrank so they would stay. He didn't know who had written them, but he knew they were true. Maybe not factually, but emotionally, spiritually, bone deep. How much of his life had been lived for applause? How much of his confidence had been camouflage? How much of his name was his? He thought of kindergarten, of drawing wild, purple animals, and being told to color inside the lines. He remembered how silence earned him gold stars, how not crying got him praised, how shrinking into the role of good boy felt like winning, even though it chipped something away each time. He stood and walked to the cracked mirror in the hallway, one he'd passed before but never truly looked into. Its edges were warped, its frame splintered, but it showed him something no clean mirror ever had: the exhaustion of becoming what others admire. He stared into it. Who have I been performing for? He thought. Not just teachers, not just bosses. Everyone, even strangers, even friends. He remembered laughing at jokes that stung, nodding through conversations that bored him, agreeing to things that bent his boundaries because saying no felt like betrayal. And then came the grief. It didn't roar. It didn't collapse him. It rose slowly, like fog, lifting from the earth. It settled in his stomach, a quiet ache, not from what had been done to him, but from what he had given away. He whispered his name, Alex. It didn't hurt, but it didn't feel like home either. He walked back into the library and sat again before the journal. But this time, he didn't read. He wrote. Not a manifesto, not a reinvention, just truth. I have been everyone but myself. I've worn names like armor. I've confused approval with belonging. I've called myself ambitious when I was afraid. I've called myself strong when I was silent. I don't want a better mask. I want no mask. The words came in waves. He didn't judge them, didn't edit, didn't try to make them poetic. They were his, not because he authored them, but because he allowed them. He paused, breathed, and then he wrote one last line. I'm not trying to find a new name. I'm trying to remember the part of me that never needed one. He closed the journal. He stepped outside. The clouds hadn't lifted, but the sky no longer felt heavy. He sat on the ground, not to meditate, not to seek, just to be. There was no lesson, no conclusion, no final wisdom, only a spaciousness, a loosening, a quiet realization that maybe what he had called identity was really a costume, and that beneath the costume wasn't something to build, but something to uncover. The boy with the dandelion, the breath in the clearing, the mirror in the water, the silence in the room. All of it had been pointing here, to the day they took his name, and to the part of him that had waited patiently, lovingly, for its return. The fire that didn't burn. By the time Alex reached the fire, night had swallowed the forest whole. No moon, no wind, just the steady crackle of flame ahead, breathing in silence. It sat in the middle of the stone circle like a heart, beating not with sound, but with presence. No one else was there. The others were either asleep or elsewhere, but it didn't matter. This moment wasn't shared. It was summoned. He stepped closer. The fire wasn't big. It didn't roar. It pulsed, a low rhythm that met his chest like a heartbeat remembered. He felt its warmth before he felt its heat. A kind of ancient recognition stirred inside him, as if this flame had known him long before he knew himself. He sat cross-legged at its edge, and the stones beneath him were cold but steady. For a long while, he just watched. No thoughts, no story, no need to name what was rising. Only flame, only breath. Then it began. Not a vision, not a memory, not exactly. More like an unfolding. One by one, they came. Versions of himself, dressed in old moments. The 17-year-old who chose a college to impress his father. The one who stayed silent during meetings, even when his gut screamed to speak. The one who said, "I'm fine," with a smile so tight it ached. They weren't ghosts. They weren't regrets. They were masks. Thin, well-constructed, worn for survival. He watched them pass across the flame like shadows on cave walls. Not to judge, just to see. And in that seeing came a question: what would happen if I let them go? He looked into the fire, not for an answer, but for a place to offer. He closed his eyes and began to name them. Not aloud, not in ceremony, but inside, one by one. The perfectionism that had driven him like a whip. The need to be understood. The guilt he wore when resting. The ambition that never quite felt like his. The silence that protected him from being seen. The charm he used to deflect. The smile that begged, "Please stay." Each one, he pictured in his hands. And with each naming, he imagined placing them into the fire, not to destroy them, but to see what remained after the illusion burned. But the fire didn't react. There was no smoke, no hiss, no protest. Everything he placed in it dissolved. Not violently, not dramatically, just vanished. And it stunned him, because for so long, He thought this pain was made of steel, that these patterns were chains, that he'd need to fight to be free. But here, in the presence of fire, nothing fought back. Because the fire didn't burn him, it revealed him. The flame didn't want his performance. It wanted his truth. He opened his eyes and looked again, not at the fire, but at what wasn't there. The masks had vanished. The noise had quieted. The air felt thinner, like something dense had been lifted. His chest rose, not with effort, but with ease, like he had more space inside than he ever realized. A breeze passed through the clearing, subtle as breath. And for the first time, he didn't brace against it. He let it move through him. And then came the final question. Not from the fire. From within. What am I? Without all of that, he didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to become anyone. He was no longer polishing the mirror. He was sitting still enough to see through it. He realized then that this was not a moment of transformation. It was a moment of returning. The fire hadn't changed him. It had only shown him what was never truly him to begin with. And that knowing landed softly, like snow, falling on still water. No splash, no disruption, just presence. He sat for what felt like hours, breathing with the fire, not seeking insight, not chasing peace, just being. He remembered something a monk once told him in a book he half-read years ago. Your task is not to become pure. Your task is to stop pretending you're not already. The fire flickered in agreement. It didn't demand sacrifice. It asked for honesty. And honesty was what made him free. Eventually, his legs began to ache. But he didn't stand yet. He reached into his jacket pocket and found the photograph. The boy with the dandelion, cheeks puffed, eyes wide. He held it near the firelight and studied it, not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror of what remained. That boy never asked to be exceptional. He just wanted to wonder. He placed the photo gently beside him on the stone, not in the fire. Not. This time. This piece was not to be burned. This piece was to be carried forward. Because now he understood, the fire didn't want everything gone. It only wanted what was never real. And in the flickering glow, he saw what remained. Stillness, breath, curiosity, presence. Not a better version of himself. A truer one. One that didn't need to prove, didn't need to fix, didn't need to be named. He stood, slowly. Not in haste, not in triumph, just with peace. The fire crackled behind him. He turned back once, not to say goodbye, but to bow. Not to the flame, but to the part of him that had finally stopped running. And in that moment, he knew he was no longer shedding skin. He was no longer in search of light. He had remembered that he was the light. The fire hadn't burned him. It had shown him what could never be burned. The door with no lock. The morning mist wrapped the trees like memory. It was thick enough to blur the path, soft enough to feel like breath. Alex stepped into it without hesitation. He wasn't being brave. He simply wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the silence, not of not knowing. There was no schedule pulling at him, no identity to protect. Just this stillness, this moment, this quiet knowing that something was ready to unfold. He didn't plan to go anywhere. He was simply walking. His feet followed a path that hadn't been there before, or maybe it had always been there, only now visible because he had stopped looking for something more impressive. The path wound through the edge of the retreat grounds, beyond the vegetable garden, beyond the fire circle. It led to a structure he'd seen only once from a distance, a greenhouse swallowed by ivy and half erased by time. Its glass panels were fogged, some cracked, its roof partially caved, beneath a weight of vines. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but something in it called to him, not loudly, not urgently, but like a memory he hadn't lived yet. As he approached, he noticed something strange. There was no door, or so it seemed. The front wall looked seamless, just panes of old glass reflecting the trees. But as he stepped closer, the reflection shimmered slightly, like a ripple through reality. And then, almost imperceptibly, a shape emerged. Not a door in the usual sense, no knob, no hinges, no frame. Just a subtle difference in the way the light moved across the glass, like a boundary waiting to be seen. He reached out and touched it. Warm, alive. He didn't push, didn't try to open it. He just stood there, palm to the glass, breathing. And slowly, something inside began to surface. Not a voice, not a thought, a feeling, familiar but unspoken. All the times he had stood in front of moments like this, doors without signs, without permission, without guarantees, and turned away. Not because they were locked, but because he was waiting to be told it was okay to walk through. He remembered them all in a rush. The time he wanted to say I love you, but said nothing. The job he didn't apply for because someone else seemed more qualified. The boundary he didn't set because he didn't want to seem difficult. The poem he never shared. The idea he buried because it might be laughed at. The question he didn't ask because he feared the answer. Each one a door. Each one unentered. Not because they were closed. Because he had learned to doubt his own readiness. Not from one person. Not from one moment. But from years of subtle shaping. Praise for being agreeable. Rewards for being cautious. Silence when he dared too much. He had mistaken hesitation for humility. Safety for wisdom. Approval for belonging. He had been waiting for someone to say, "You may," but the door had never been locked. He stepped forward, and just like that, it vanished. Not swung open, not crumbled, vanished. Because there was never anything there to push, only something to stop resisting. The air inside the greenhouse was still, thick with scent, earth, old wood, something faintly sweet and decaying. Dust floated in narrow shafts of sunlight. The glass above was fractured but beautiful, like stained light scattered through time. He expected to find plants, but there were none. Just a single chair in the center. Wooden, worn, waiting. He Saturday, not because he had to, because it felt right. And as he did, the stillness deepened. Not just around him, within. The kind of stillness that doesn't erase thought, but makes room for it. That doesn't demand silence, but honors it. It wasn't peace in the way he once imagined. Tranquil music, soft candles, lotus posture. It was raw, present, alive. And in that space, something ancient stirred, not from the past, but from beneath the noise of now. A question, not spoken, not even formed, just felt. And he realized he didn't need to answer. He needed to allow it to echo. He needed to not rush toward insight, not grasp for revelation, but stay open long enough for truth to recognize itself. The room held him like a breath held at the edge of exhale. And then it came. A memory, maybe, or a vision, or just the simplest kind of truth. He saw himself sitting here, not this version of him, but a deeper one. Not Alex, the name, not Alex, the role, but the awareness that had always been there. The one watching since childhood. The one who had cried silently, beneath laughter. The one who had stayed awake during every performance, whispering, "This is not all of you." He saw that awareness sitting across from him now, without form, without face. It didn't teach. It didn't speak. It just was. And in its presence, he understood what had never been lost. That the real prison was never made of expectation. It was made of forgetting. And the key was never far. It was breath. It was attention. It was the moment he chose to stop waiting for permission and simply said yes. Not yes to ambition. Not yes to self-improvement. Yes to being. He remembered something the old man had said, though maybe he had never said it aloud. The Buddha is not something you reach. It's something you stop denying. And in that moment, Alex didn't feel enlightened. He felt real. He didn't feel powerful. He felt whole. Not perfect, but present. And presence was enough. The glass above caught a shimmer of sun, breaking into colors that danced across the floor. He watched the patterns without chasing them. He had no desire to interpret, no urgency to hold on. He was not collecting experience. He was letting experience move through him. And for the first time, he saw clearly. There had never been a locked door. Only the belief that there was. There had never been something missing. Only the forgetting that he had always belonged. He didn't cry. He didn't laugh. He simply breathed. And with each breath, the illusion of separation softened. The need to arrive faded. The longing to be more dissolved into a quiet, sacred enoughness. He wasn't discovering something new. He was remembering what had always been true. That he had never been waiting for a key. He had been waiting to remember. There was no lock. The step without a path. Alex woke before the sun, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty. He didn't stretch or yawn. He simply sat up. There was nothing special about the moment. No dramatic light piercing the paper windows. No grand realization rising in his chest. It was simpler than that. It was stillness, and that stillness was enough. He moved slowly, folding his blanket with care. He packed the same small backpack he'd brought with him days ago, though now it felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. A few clothes, the notebook, now heavy with pages, the photo of himself as a child. Nothing more. He didn't look in the mirror, not because he was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing to check. There was no persona left to adjust. The grounds were wrapped in soft indigo, the light not yet broken. He passed familiar places now drenched in unfamiliar calm. The stone circle, the steps he once scrubbed, the window he had once cleaned while questioning everything. Each one a chapter in a story that didn't need to be told, only lived. At the gate, he paused, not in hesitation, but in reverence. He bowed, not to a teacher, not to a temple, to the moment. Then he stepped beyond it. There was no road waiting, no itinerary, no signpost that read, "This way to your next becoming." Only earth, beneath his feet, and sky above his breath. He walked, not with purpose, with presence, not because he had found an answer, but because he no longer needed one. His legs carried him gently, almost instinctively, like they remembered something he'd forgotten. Trees passed without needing names. Birds sang without metaphor. Everything around him was exactly what it was, untranslated, unfiltered. The world was no longer something to interpret. It was something to be with. He stopped at a stream and drank straight from his hands. The water tasted like sky. He ate bread he'd packed the night before, not mindlessly, not gratefully, just fully. Every chew a ceremony, every swallow a letting go. Hours passed, or maybe they didn't. Time had long since stopped asking to be measured. He sat beneath a sycamore, let his spine lean against its bark, and watched the leaves flutter. In wind he couldn't feel, and that's when he heard it, the hum of a phone vibrating in his pack. He had forgotten it existed. Its screen was cracked, the battery nearly gone. But it was still there, silent all this time, waiting like a relic from another self. One message blinked. "Where are you? We need the final report. You've missed 3 meetings." No anger, no warmth, just logistics. Alex read it like he might read an article about someone else's life. Factual, unnecessary. He didn't reply, not from rebellion, but because there was no one left to respond as. He sat still for a long time, the device warm in his hand, buzzing faintly again with a second message. "Hey, I saw something that reminded me of you. Are you okay? I missed the real you." That one reached deeper, not like a hook, like a mirror. The real you. He didn't smile. He didn't ache. He just breathed and let the words pass through him like wine through a forest that no longer needed to hold on to leaves. He opened the notebook, wrote one line, "I'm here," and turned the phone off. He laid back, arms outstretched, like a boy in tall grass, watching the clouds tumble across a sky that no longer felt distant. He didn't think about next steps. He didn't think about integration. He didn't think about anything, really. There was just the hum of life, not as a concept, but as a pulse through his ribs, as wind against his skin, as the presence of breath with no one in control. He stood again, not to go anywhere, but because his body wanted to move. He walked. And with each step, something rare happened. He didn't step into a role. He didn't step into clarity. He stepped into the unknown with no need to conquer it. And that was liberation. He passed an old man on the road. Their eyes met. No words, but in the glance, something passed between them. Mutuality, perhaps. Recognition without history. Like two fires acknowledging each other's flame. Alex didn't think. This is awakening. He didn't need to frame it. He didn't need to hold it. He just walked. And walking became prayer. He remembered the stories he once read, of monks who wandered with bowls and bare feet, of mystics who disappeared into deserts not to be alone, but to be whole. He used to think those stories were about escape, but now he saw them for what they were, a return, not to wilderness, to what had never left. He passed a family having a picnic. Children ran past him laughing, their faces full of light. A mother called out a name. He couldn't hear it clearly, but it was beautiful. Not the name itself, the love behind it. He felt something soften in his chest. And for the first time, he felt no tension in being seen. Because there was nothing left to project. No image to uphold. No persona to repair. He wasn't trying to be spiritual. He wasn't trying to be real. He simply was. The sky stretched out above him like a vast silence made visible. It held no meaning, and that was its gift. Meaning, he realized, was not something to chase. It was something to carry, quietly, gently, without needing to prove it. Later that day, as the sun tilted westward, he found a bench by the edge of a lake. The water mirrored the sky, and the sky mirrored nothing. He took out the photo from his bag. The boy with the dandelion, caught in that moment before breath turned into scatter. He looked at it for a long time and whispered, "You waited well." Then he held it to his chest, not as a relic, but as a reminder that everything he had sought had never been somewhere to get to. It had always been somewhere to return from. He closed his eyes, and there, without a path beneath him, without a title, without a story to finish, Alex took one more step into the world, into himself, into now. The return that was never a departure. Alex stepped off the train with a single bag slung over his shoulder. The city air was the same as when he left, metallic, fast, a little indifferent. Cars honked. People passed with earbuds in, faces locked into invisible missions. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. His steps landed more slowly now, not heavy, but grounded. The sidewalk was still concrete, but his feet didn't rush across it anymore. They moved like they were in conversation with the earth beneath. Each step said, "I'm here." He didn't head straight home. Instead, he wandered, past familiar coffee shops, past the office building with its mirrored windows and cold lobbies, past the intersection where he used to time his walk to avoid waiting for the light. The city pulsed around him, but it no longer dictated his rhythm. He stopped in front of a cafe he once frequented. Inside, people hunched. Over laptops, faces pinched with focus. A barista repeated names like a chant. Karen, Ryan, Angela. He smiled, not out of nostalgia, but recognition. He used to sit at that back table, headphones in, productivity tabs open, a to-do list thick with proof of worth. He walked on. Back in his apartment, everything was where he left it. The espresso machine blinked 12 o'clock. His calendar pinged reminders for meetings he wouldn't attend. There were unopened packages by the door. Life had tried to continue without him, like a machine that didn't notice one cog had gone missing. But now, the cog had returned, not to turn faster, but to question why it turned at all. He unpacked slowly. The notebook, the photo, the small folded note from the school with no walls. Watch everything, say nothing. He taped it to the inside of his cupboard, next to the vitamins, and coffee filters. That night, he sat on the floor not because he wanted to meditate, not to recreate some memory of silence, but because that's where his body wanted to be. The hum of the fridge was loud again, but this time it didn't feel invasive. It felt like a companion. He breathed, not to calm himself, just because breath was there, and it was enough. In the days that followed, Alex didn't change his job. He didn't announce a life transformation or start a blog. He didn't try to share what he'd learned. Instead, he returned to work. Same desk, same people, but something had shifted, not outside, but within. In meetings, he listened, not to reply, not to prepare a smarter response, but just to listen. And strangely, others spoke more slowly around him, as if his presence gave space for thoughts to finish before rushing to the next. He no longer filled silences out of politeness. He didn't force small talk. He said, "I don't know." When? He didn't. He declined invitations without guilt. He laughed when it was real. He cried once, quietly, after reading an old email that reminded him who he used to pretend to be. He started walking to work instead of driving. He stopped tracking his sleep. He didn't count his steps. He deleted 3 productivity apps without ceremony. Not as rebellion, as release. He noticed the sky more, the color of the wind, the way his hands moved when he wasn't thinking about them. At a party one evening, someone asked him what he'd been up to. Alex paused. "I've been here," he said. The person laughed, unsure what to make of it. But Alex didn't explain. The statement wasn't for them. It was for himself. One afternoon, in line at a grocery store, a child behind him started to cry. Frustrated, loud, wild with emotion. The mother bent low, apologizing, trying to quiet the child. Alex turned, not to judge or intervene, but simply to offer the child a smile. No lesson, no trick, just the kind of attention that says, "I see you." The child stopped crying, not because of magic, but because something unspoken had been allowed. Alex didn't feel wise. He didn't feel special. He felt human, fully, and that was more than enough. The people around him noticed, subtly. They couldn't quite name it. "You're different," someone said once. More still, but he wasn't performing presence. He wasn't wearing stillness like a new outfit. He was just no longer leaving himself. He didn't need to call it awakening. Didn't need to call it anything. It was just the way a river returns to flow after ice melts. Not with a roar, but with movement that doesn't explain itself. And then, weeks later, he received a message from someone he hadn't heard from in years, a friend from long ago. The message said only, "I think I forgot who I am. Can you talk?" He stared at the message, not with pressure, not with the urge to fix or teach. He replied, "Come over. I'll put the kettle on." That night, he lit a candle, not for ceremony, not for ambience, but simply to share light. He made tea. He sat across from his friend and said nothing profound, just listened. And at some point, his friend began to cry, not because of anything Alex did, but because they had been given the one thing most people never receive, space to return. And in that moment, Alex understood something more clearly than ever. He hadn't gone on a journey to become someone new. He hadn't ascended. He hadn't transformed. He had simply stopped pretending to be anyone else. The return was never a return, because the self that had been waiting had never left. It had only been silenced beneath roles, names, hopes, fears, but it was always there. And now, it no longer needed to hide.